The Oregon Trail by James P. Berger.
Moving to origin. Wagons a-ho! With these words called out, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children headed west on the Oregon Trail. Oregon Trail during the mid-1800s. They packed their covered wagons in the east and joined others for the dangerous, exciting voyage to the Oregon Territory. The east was growing crowded. People kept moving west to settle and plant their crops. Eastern Oregon seemed like a perfect place to farm. It had large amounts of unsettled land with fertile soil. Traveling along the Oregon Trail to get there, though, was very hard. Immigrants followed the trail for nearly 6 months, through strange territories, to their new homes. In what is now the northwestern United States, the U.S. government planned to expand the country from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This idea was called the Manifest Destiny. Right. The wagon wheel ruts along the Oregon Trail can still be seen today near Burnt Ranch, Wyoming. And set. This picture from 1871 is called Pilgrims of the Plains. It shows members of a wagon trail camping at night.
Making the trail. In May 1843, farmer Jesse Applegate led nearly 1,000 people on the Oregon Trail. But long before that, Native Americans had settled the West. Native Americans knew the best routes through the parts of the countryside and wore short footpaths across the land by traveling them often. By the early 1800s, the Western territories were beginning to attract white settlers, mostly fur trappers. They hoped to make a living by hunting animals and selling furs. The trail seemed too difficult for most people to follow, but in 1863, Marcus Whitman arrived in Oregon with his wife and 2 missionaries. He built a mission and proved to people back east that they could also make the trip. Did you know many mountain men hunted for furs, but others lived out west, simply to have adventures? These men connected many rugged Native American footpaths into the 2,000-mile-long Oregon Trail, or 3,219 kilometers long. Top. This map shows the Oregon Trail's route, which wound along rivers, through streams, and up mountains, and across deserts. Left. Fur trappers traveling alone were called mountain men. They used parts of the trail before immigrants took the route to the west.
What to take. Each spring during the mid-1800s, cities like Independence, Missouri, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, bustled with eager immigrants preparing for the Oregon Trail. They spent months planning and hoped to cross the mountains into Oregon before winter. Some people tried to take in their entire household with jamming iron stoves, rugs, and furniture into their small covered wagons. Some immigrants were wiser, though. They had heard stories about how difficult the trail could be. Too many useless items would slow them down. These people took only necessary items, such as dried food, clothing. They also carried certain recommendations for treating illnesses and disease, such as a special toxic or powders. Travelers often came down with scurvy, a disease that caused by a lack of vitamin C. They could treat this disease by eating fruits, vegetables, and vinegar. Parts of a covered wagon still can be seen today in Wyoming near the Oregon Trail. An accordion with a watch, a watch, and a tobacco tin were among these items used by travelers on the Oregon Trail.
Immigrants covered wagons. Immigrants needed a small, sturdy wagon to make the trip along the Oregon Trail. Most immigrants chose to modify their farm wagons. The wheels and axles on which the wheels turned were made to be strong and straight. The wooden wagon body was sealed with tar to protect supplies against the weather. A heavy, waterproof cloth pulled tight over an upside-down U-shaped frame covered the body. During storms, this cover could protect the travelers. The wagons were small and tightly packed. Many immigrants rode horses, but walked alongside the wagons during the pleasant weather. Only small children or sick people rode up front in the wagon. Right. A family takes shelter under the canvas top of their prairie schooner. People who took needless items, like cabinets and desks, often were sorry that they had. To tighten their loads, they had to leave the items scattered along the trail. Bottom. Wagon trains created a lot of dust and noise on the trail. Every wagon had a certain position within the train. To make the positions fair, so that the wagon that leaded did not always lead, while the other ones just ate its dust, a different wagon led each day. Did you know? A common name for the covered wagons was prairie schooners. They often like schooners, a type of sailboat, sailing across the windy, grassy prairies of places like today's Kansas and Nebraska. 2 or 4 horses or oxen usually pulled the prairie schooners.
Unexpected dangers. Nearly every man crossing the Oregon Trail carried a gun. They expected to encounter a furious Native American warriors like those in the wild stories they had heard in the East. The wagon trains did not get far before meeting Native Americans who were friendly and wanted to trade. People wrote home about the kind Native Americans who sometimes guided the wagon trains along parts of the trail. The immigrants told of their own true experience with them. There were unexpected dangers along the way. Though guns misfired, people fell from the wagons, children were crushed by the wagon wheels, and immigrants carried the disease called cholera. The trail became lined with gravestones because of cholera. Some Native Americans got the disease from immigrants. The Native Americans took it back to their camps. Many of the others at these camps died from cholera too. Left. Gravestones lined the Oregon Trail, many because of cholera. Right. An ad for ginger tonic shows a trailer reviving an immigrant with a dose of the beverage. The ad claims that the tonic is a cure for cholera and other illnesses.
Forts. 5 forts built by fur trappers and the U.S. Army aided the immigrants during their trip to Oregon. Some offered more services than others. Fort Kearney along the Platte River in Nebraska was the first fort the immigrants reached after leaving Independence or St. Joseph, Missouri. People used it mostly as a post office. Mountain men Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez built Fort Bridger in Wyoming in 1843. The fort had a store, a fur trading post, and a place for people to rest. Forts provided more than just supplies or a place to rest, though. They also helped the immigrants keep track of their distance they had traveled. The fort's soldiers often protected the travelers from dangers on the Oregon Trail. Did you know 2 forts in Idaho became major stops on the route? Fort Hall as well stocked trading post, but Fort Boise, the last fort before Oregon, may have been the most pleasing sight. At Fort Boise, immigrants could restock their supplies that by time had run dangerously low on the small wagon. Below, Fort Laramie in Wyoming started out as Fort William in 1834, renamed Fort Laramie in 1849. It had a blacksmith, a wagon maker's shop, and 3 bakeries. When immigrants reached Fort Laramie, they were 1/3 of way to Oregon. Above, a bedroom from Fort Berger now today looks like it did when the mountain men Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez built the fort as a fur trading post in 1843.
The West sights to see. The Western Territories look very different from the lands back east, and that made the trip exciting. At night, when there was extra time before going to bed, people told stories or sang around campfires. The immigrants put all the covered wagons into a circle at night to protect their camp. Then they felt safe in the vast Western Territories. Some of the natural features of the West amazed the immigrants. In eastern Idaho, the water in the soda springs bubbled. The immigrants put citric acid and sugar in the water and drank it as though it were lemonade. There were other strange springs along the way, too. Steamboat springs shot gas into the air and sounded like the hissing of a steamboat engine. Some hot springs were nearly boiled, so it could be found along the trail. Immigrants on the Oregon Trail saw many natural wonders, such as weather-worn bluffs, tall rock columns, and cliffs worn by riverbeds. Chimney Rock, Nebraska. Independence Rock, Wyoming. Castle Rock, Oregon. A wagon train on the trail.
River crossing. Most of the Oregon Trail followed the Platte, Snake, Columbia rivers toward the west. The wagon trains had to cross these rivers where they came to a bend. Wagons that floated made the crossing easier. Oxen dragged these wagons across the river, but sometimes they were too exhausted to swim. They got stuck in the current and drowned. Some Native Americans and fur trappers built ferries and bridges across the river, especially after more and more wagon trains appeared on the trail. They charged tolls for using their ferries and bridges. These tolls were expensive, but the wagon trains could cross faster and more safer by using them. Did you know some travelers could not afford to pay these expensive tolls? Some refused to pay. They risked driving their wagons through the rivers and bridge, or when a bridge or ferry was just within sight. Above, river crossing were dangerous. Wagons might sink or people might be washed away and drowned. Bottom, ferries like this one on the Platte River buried in their sides. Some small rafts were used as ferries and could hold only one wagon at a time. These small ferries often sank. The bigger, stronger ferries could carry 3 or more wagons at once.
Over the mountains. The first settlers of West crossed the Rocky Mountains to reach their destination. On October 22nd, 1812, a Scottish fur trader named Robert Stewart discovered a 20-mile wide, 32-kilometer wide gap in the Rocky Mountains. This easy route through the Rockies near today's Casper, Wyoming, was called the South Pass. Its discovery meant that only the Blue Mountains were left for most immigrants to cross. The Blue Mountains still were dangerous, though they were not as high as the Rocky Mountains. Luckily, they were the last major obstacle before reaching Oregon. Mountain men and Native Americans often were hired as guides to lead wagon trains in the Rockies parts of the trail. Many guides wagon trains through the Rockies parts of the trail. Many guides knew the area well and gave trustworthy help to the weary immigrants. Some guides only offered direction for shortcuts that led to travelers into dangerous situations. Left. Immigrants had to bring tools and spare wagon parts with them on the Oregon Trail. Below. Travelers had to cross the Rockies before the winter, or they might be stranded and starve.
After crossing the trail's end, after crossing the Blue Mountains, the immigrants reached Oregon. Most didn't stop until they reached the Willamette Valley in western Oregon. In Astoria, immigrants could find out about the best places to live and farm. Just because they had completed their long journey did not mean the work stopped. Houses and farms needed to be built, and quickly, too. The immigrants began their voyage in the spring. Winter would meet them shortly after their arrival in Oregon. Around 300,000 people traveled to Oregon between 1843 and the late 1850s. Some wagon trails did set out after this time. The last went during the 1890s, just 20 years before the automobile was invented. Although the name scratched into the Independence Rock has faded, they remind us of those who bravely helped the United States grow from sea to shining sea.